All right, welcome everybody to Technically Speaking's wrap-up episode for Season 3. This is Brandon Burton with CoreLogic, here to share with you some of the highlights from Season 3, some recap conversations on some of the lessons that we learned throughout the course of this year, talk a little bit about next year and what's upcoming for Technically Speaking, and also to run a bit of an extended Q&A session at the end of today. I think we'll have ample time for addressing a number of questions in an open town hall setting. As we round out the year this year, we're also using a new platform for Technically Speaking, using Teams. I know those that have been with us before, we've traditionally done this in Zoom. So a little bit different look, but generally the same thing. Just as a couple of housekeeping notes, the area that I'll be paying attention to for questions is the Q&A area inside of Teams, not the chat. So please, if you have any questions that you'd like addressed at the end of today's session, at any time, drop those into the Q&A tool. Anything in the world of restoration is fair game. Anything in the world of standards, which is the other hat that I wear in this industry, feel free to drop those questions into the Q&A at any point. And as we come to the end of today's session, we'll walk through the questions in the order that they are received. So kind of first come, first serve there. So if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please drop that in there now. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. To start things off here, I want to start with a little bit of a recap of what kind of as key topics that we addressed in 2024. Many of these are the things that we're going to step through today and talk a little bit about and kind of recap some of the key lessons that come out of each of these topics. So this year, we did a real deep dive into the drying chamber, which is a bit of a misnomer because the IICRC's S500 refers to them as drying environments. We'll talk a little bit about that today. We'll also talk a bit about classes of water and some of the most common misconceptions around class of water. We had a guest speaker this year that came in and spoke with us about categories of water versus mold and how these two interrelate. We'll talk a little bit about that and recap some of those discussions. We'll talk about airflow and interstitial spaces. One of my personal soapboxes, because it's an area that gets overlooked so much in our industry. We'll talk about dry standards and drying goals, touch on dehumidification and humidity control, as the S500 would refer to it, and then round out with a discussion on air filtration devices. So we've got a lot on the plate today, but really we're just going to hit the highlights. We're going to hit the most important notes out of each one of these topics as we go through. So it'll be a great summary of some of the most important content that we had throughout the entire year this year. After we complete that, like I said, we'll do a little bit of an introduction into what's coming in 2025. We'll also talk a little bit about some upcoming announcements for next year. And then finally, we'll wrap up with our Q&A session. So first, let's dive into drying environments. The conversation around drying environments and drying chambers is really best led by just taking a look at a floor plan and understanding how drying chambers or drying environments are defined in the scope of an actual water mitigation project. One of the things that really stood out to me this year, one of the things that I do a lot of is I do a lot of work with our industry standards, like the S500, for example, or water damage standard. I work with a lot of folks that have been in the industry for a good deal of time, and also do a lot of support, technical support, for folks that have drying jobs and something's going wrong or something's going sideways with an estimate, and they want some support to help them better understand how to approach a particular aspect of the job. And one of the things that's really stood out to me this year is that, the concept of understanding what a drying chamber actually is not real well understood in our industry at times. And because it's such a foundational piece to managing a drying project, that was the reason why we dedicated an entire episode to it this year. And in that episode, there were really a couple of things that we drew out. First of all, not every drying project has multiple drying chambers, even if that project has multiple rooms. And that's one of the first things that I really want to kind of call attention to. And I'll do that just by simply marking out an affected area here on this particular screen. Let's say that our affected area that we were dealing with is this area that I've just shaded here in blue. If this area is the affected area of this particular structure, Notice that the affected area overlaps multiple rooms. Depending on how you count those rooms, you could say that that affected area overlaps 4 to 5 different rooms that are in this particular property. Just because there are 5 rooms doesn't mean we have 5 chambers, and that's one of the first things that I wanted to address when we unveiled that episode. When you can create circulation, air circulation between affected areas using your air movement, and force the air to move between those spaces, all of those spaces can be considered a single chamber. Now, there are several things that I will consider when we make that determination. One of the things that I might consider is not only can I make adequate air circulation between these spaces, but another thing that I may consider is there anything that is uniquely sensitive to my drying efforts in any of those spaces, right? Or are there any other considerations that cause concern or alarm, like contamination that may be present in one or more of those spaces that's not ubiquitous or not consistent throughout the drying chamber? So those are 2 key factors I'll consider. For example, if in one of these rooms I had contamination as a significant concern for one reason or another, let's say there's some pre-existing microbial growth that is in this particular room, but not in the rest of these rooms. Let's say there was some hazardous substance that was present and spilled in one of these rooms, but not the rest of these rooms. Or let's say that there may be asbestos-containing materials in this particular room, but not the rest of these rooms. Then I may separate or quarantine that particular area off from the rest of my drying environment for those concerns and create 2 separate drying chambers, even though there is an ability to create air circulation. But the air circulation may be problematic, right? However, notwithstanding any of those types of limitations, then my drying chamber typically is going to be all of these rooms and establishing air movement that allows me to effectively circulate air between all of these spaces. Now, that taps into a separate episode that we had in technically speaking, where we talked in depth about air mover installations. But just to kind of illustrate the effect, when I have air movers that are drawing from one space and dropping air into the next, and I set up that airflow pattern throughout my drying environment to draw from one space and drop into the next throughout this entire chamber. So again, the intake on one side and the outlet into the next, then I can effectively force this air to circulate and communicate throughout this entire space. That is what establishes a drying chamber. All right. Now, the second step in this is, now that I know that I can communicate the air between all of these rooms, the second layer of the question is, what about all of this space, right? Does that space really need to be a part of my drying chamber? Now, if the rest of this space is unaffected, furthermore, if the rest of the space is going to be occupied, and that space is larger in volume than my affected space, then one of the considerations that really should be made is whether or not you want to contain your drying chamber down to the space that is actually impacted. And this is an interesting question because it's not a super easy question to answer, right? Should I or should I not erect a containment barrier to make my affected area smaller when I'm dealing with a partially affected area? And I've debated this question a number of times with a number of industry experts. And generally, where I see some consensus in industry is when that containment is either going to prevent occupancy from impacting your drying process, if that's practical, right? Or when that containment is going to minimize or reduce the amount of air you're managing by 50% or more, then generally it's advantageous, right? Advantageous. Meaning, if I were to erect this barrier, and by erecting this barrier, my affected area is less than 50% of the total air volume of this space, then generally that's beneficial, right? That's going to keep the effort of my dehumidification more concentrated. It's going to allow me to have a more exact control over the temperature and humidity within that space. Now, having said that, there are caveats that you have to consider when you do this. One caveat is that if by containing that space, I make the space so small that my dehumidifier now exceeds the amount of dehumidification needed in that space by an order of magnitude of 2 or more, then generally we would not want to make that containment. And I'll give you kind of a case in point for this, because I know that may sound a little confusing at first blush. Let's say that my affected area is only a small bathroom, and that bathroom is only 30 or 40 square feet. With my ceiling heights and my flooring area, if I were to do the math in a space like that, it probably needs like 20 pints of dehumidification when I do my math and I do my calculation. If I then install a 75 pint dehumidifier, close the door and contain that space down to what only needed 22, you're going to end up with heat issues because you've more than doubled the amount of dehumidification necessary in that space, and then confined that space, you're going to overheat that space. And I find that generally to be true, even with energy efficient low grain refrigerants or LGRs. I find that generally to be true. Anytime you double the amount of dehumidification needed in a space and then quarantine or enclose that space, you generally run into heat problems. And heat problems will get you a couple of different ways. One, if the temperature runs up too high, you're going to limit the performance of the dehumidifier. And secondarily, if the temperature runs too high, you can excite water in unaffected materials like cabinetry, for example, and cause overdrying and stress cracking and shrinking of things that can lead to permanent damages. So that's another caveat to consider. Now, another angle on this before we leave this conversation of erecting a drying chamber is that sometimes what we're dealing with is an affected area that looks something more like this, where we have an affected area that is migrated across two spaces where air cannot be circulated between these spaces. This is when a second drying chamber becomes an absolute, right? I have a common wall that runs right between unit 1 and unit 2 of this apartment building or this condo or whatever this is. There is no means for me to circulate air between space 1 and space 2, right? The only way I could create circulation between these two spaces is if I created an opening in this wall assembly somehow. And because this is a common wall, probably a firewall, unless it's damaged and requires demolition, I wouldn't want to disrupt or disturb that wall. So naturally, the air circulated in one space is not going to be communicating with the air circulated in the second space. And that's what constitutes the need for two separate drying chambers, is when I cannot force the air to communicate between these two entirely separate spaces. So this would be two entirely separate drying chambers. Last and final note on drying chambers before we move on. The final note here would be that you have to ensure that your drying chamber is open to and communicating with interstitial cavities and spaces, right? It looks like some people, by the way, I have a note here that some people are not seeing the screen. Could you do me a favor and just give me a thumbs up or give me some sort of indication if you are able to see the screen, and just make sure that that is coming through. Good, it is coming through. Outstanding. So if you're not seeing the screen, then you may want to rejoin just to make sure that you are seeing the screen. So it looks like the majority of those that are on with us are indeed seeing the screen.
Yeah. Yes, Brandon, I can see it, but I am seeing the chats where some cannot. So
perfect. Thank you, Mary Catherine. Yeah, so you may want to rejoin. It may be the strength of your internet connection, whether or not that's allowing you to see that. So just go ahead and rejoin. And then Mary Catherine will watch to allow anybody back in that is rejoining. Thank you, Mary Catherine. So the final note there on drying chambers is don't forget your interstitial cavities and voids. You know, the drying chamber has to circulate air through and across all affected spaces and surfaces. Every surface that is wet and evaporating needs to see that air circulated into and out of that space. That includes wall cavities. If you have the backside of your wallboard that is wet, the studs are wet, insulation in the cavity is wet, water ran down from above, for example, you had standing water that was present that would force that to occur. If you have water beneath cabinets, behind cabinets, inside and underneath built-ins, then air needs to be circulated into and throughout those spaces as a part of the drying chamber. And this is another area that gets overlooked a lot. And the reason why we end up with problem areas in drying is because if I don't do a thorough assessment and truly understand where my wet surfaces are, and then follow that up with my air mover installations to ensure air is moving across those surfaces, then I'm not effectively drying all of those materials, right? And that gets even more scary when you consider that our common instrumentation methods do not typically observe, materials that are deeper than the top half of an inch in an assembly, especially our non-invasive meters. We'll touch on that in a little bit. So that's drying chambers. Those were some of the key lessons learned about drying chambers in that episode we had earlier this year. If a lot of that topic sounds brand new to you, if some of that was absolutely earth-shattering and revolutionary to you, I highly encourage that you go back early into the 2024 season and take a look at the drying chamber and class of water discussion that we had in that episode, because we spent a full hour on that topic. The next topic that we addressed this year that I found personally very, very interesting and really shed some light on some key topics in our industry was when we had a guest presenter, a gentleman named Jim Pearson, come in with us from the S520. Jim's the chair of the S520, a mold remediation standard consensus body. And he shared with us some thoughts about the relationship between the S520, mold remediation, and the S500, water damage restoration, right? And some of the key things that came out of that discussion, which are literally word for word right out of these standards, is that there is no direct relationship between the presence of mold and the categorization of water. And that to me is it's a paramount understanding in our industry. It's something that as restorers we really need to understand. The presence of mold does not impact the category of water. And just let that sink in for a second if that's not something you were already aware of. In other words, if I have a category 1 water damage and I discover pre-existing mold growth, that doesn't change the category of my water damage. It's still a category 1. Now, what it does do is it invokes the standard of care from the S520 for dealing with the mold, not your category 3 water requirements, your S520 requirements. And those requirements are based on conditions, condition 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? 1, 2, and 3, rather. It invokes the conditions. So follow your S520 when we encounter mold, follow your S500 when we encounter elevated degrees of biological contamination other than mold or other hazardous substances. All right, so that was kind of the key lesson learned as we walked through that conversation with the S500 versus the S520. Again, if there's anything earth-shattering in that message that I'm sharing with you on that key lesson learned, we have an entire episode dedicated to that, where we go through that conversation with Mr. Pearson from the S520 consensus body. All right, moving forward, another topic that we addressed this year was dry standards and drying goals. And this, to me, this is a key, because in dry standards and drying goals, there was a change in the most recent edition of the S500 standard. Early in the 2020s, when we rolled to the most recent edition of the S500, some language changes were made in and around drying goals. And old habits, they're hard to break, right? The previous edition of the S500 gave some very specific standard of care guidelines around establishing drying goals for softwoods, for hardwoods, establishing drying goals based on a percentage tolerance around dry standards. And that became kind of an industry norm for a period of time based on the information that was in that standard at the time. The S500 has been updated, and it's been updated now for several years. And that update brought a change to the way that the industry's drying goals are established. Now, what I've given you here on the slide, first of all, is the section in the new standard that discusses it. It's section 10.6.6, dry standards and drying goals, and some of the key phrases that are in that language. And I want to kind of highlight those key phrases for you here in a recap of those lessons learned. First of all, the restorer may, and I want to stress the word may. May is a defined term in the S500, and what may is a permissive statement. It's not a requirement, it's a permissive statement. So where the S500 or any ANSI IICRC standard for that matter uses the word may, what they're saying is they're giving the reader, the restorer in this case, permission to do the following. The restorer may use dry standards to determine the drying goal. Right, so you have permission to do that. And it's not a requirement that you do that. A dry standard is not necessarily your drying goal, and your drying goal does not necessarily have to be based solely on a dry standard. Okay. The second statement that is really critical is that the dry standards are established by the restorer. And this is also super critical. Your dry standards are established by you as the restorer. Okay, you make that determination. Now you have to be properly qualified to do so. And the S500 talks about how there's a need for you to fully understand the instruments that you're using and their limitations, the knowledge that you should have as a restorer to make that determination. So that's all also very critical language, but it is restorer determined. Okay. The next key part of the discussion on drying goals is what they are set to accomplish. And there are two things that are specifically stated as what they are set to accomplish. And those two things are to return the structure to an acceptable condition and to inhibit microbial growth. At the end of the day, that's what the drying goal is set to do. Now, what do we mean by return the structure to an acceptable condition? Well, that depends, and it depends on the final bullet on this slide, and we'll get into that in a second. But a part of that is what kind of material are you dealing with, and at what moisture level does that material return to its normal appearance, its normal function, its normal integrity? What moisture content is necessary to establish that? And then ultimately to also prevent the likelihood of microbial growth, right? At what point is the moisture content or moisture level low enough that we know mold or other microbial growth is not going to occur? Now, regardless of the dry standard, and this is the key in the current edition of the S500, regardless of the dry standard, if you accomplish these two goals, then who cares what the dry standard is, right? If it looks like it did before it was wet, it performs like it did, it has the same structural strength and integrity, and mold cannot grow, then the rest, quite frankly, is super irrelevant, right? Now, dry standards and drying goals are then further discussed in that section. Talks a little bit about the relationship about dry standards and drying goals, but then the section concludes with when a restorer does establish a drying goal, the restorer should consider the scope of work that they are set out to accomplish in the structure, the complexities that that particular job presents, the specific assembly that is being dried and the relationship of moisture and effective moisture on that assembly, the completion criteria that you are agreeing to with your client, historical data for moisture levels with your instruments in your geographic area, season variability, assembly requirements such as adhesives and the performance of surface layers and materials and coatings, and then finally, any published resources that you have at your disposal that will inform that decision. Now, that's a lot more flexibility, and that's probably the most important word I can apply to this as a lesson learned. That's a lot more flexibility to the restorer to have more license to set a drying goal that's appropriate for that unique project. And that was the intent of the update in the S500, is to remove the requirement that we be tied to a dry standard specifically for establishing a drying goal and have the freedom to establish that drying goal on any logical basis that we as a restorer can determine, as long as we're qualified to make that determination with our instruments. Okay. So very long discussion on a very small section of the S500 that is uber critical to establishing the foundation for what we're setting out to accomplish in a water damage restoration project. So again, if this is a topic that was earth-shattering and revolutionary, as I discussed the highlights of this, we have an entirely dedicated episode specifically to this topic that we addressed about midway through this year. So just look up the episode in season 24 for dry standards and drying goals. If this is at all, like I said, changing your paradigm on what a drying goal is. All right. Now that we're hitting about the halfway point here on the content, I want to remind everybody that if you have any questions you'd like addressed during the Q&A today, make sure you drop those into the Q&A tool so that we can address those at the end of today's episode. All right, it looks like I've got one post that has been dropped in there as a question. If you have any other questions, drop them into the Q&A. And Mary Catherine, if you can confirm for me, I see one question posted. Just make sure you're seeing the same for me on your end. I would appreciate that. So the next topic here I want to dive into, and Mary Catherine, go ahead. Did you see just one question posted?
There are two. You need to click the see more.
Got it. All right.
Tab. Yep.
I will refresh it when we get the Q&A. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So the next topic here I want to address that we touched on this year in Technically Speaking is the subject of dehumidification. Now, dehumidification in the S500 is most commonly referred to as humidity control, right? Which is a more accurate way of saying what we're trying to accomplish with our dehumidification equipment. It's also more encompassing because dehumidifiers, right, mechanical machines, aren't the only way that we can control humidity within a drying space, right? Depending on the geography and your local climate, the time of year, there can be much more effective means for controlling humidity within an affected area than just using mechanical dehumidification, right? Especially if the outdoor air is suitable. Having said that, when we discuss humidity control within an environment, the one analogy that I always come to first is this water in a bucket analogy. And this is really important to set up before we get into the lessons learned with humidity control. And to set this up, let's just imagine for a moment that we have a bucket, and that's what we're looking at on screen here is a bucket. And inside of this bucket, we have a certain amount of water that is present. Let's say this bucket is approximately, half full of water, right? You call it half empty, depending on your perspective in life. So this bucket has a certain amount of water in it. Let's relate this in the analogy to humidity. Let's say that you walk into a drying environment and there's a certain amount of humidity that is in the air in that project in a given period of time. Now, that humidity at one point in time on a drying project isn't super relevant. What's relevant is what is happening to that humidity over time, right? Is the humidity increasing in that environment over time, or is the humidity decreasing in that environment over time? Which of those two is occurring? Now, if you see humidity increasing over time, that obviously should be a red flag, right? If the humidity is increasing over time, then it's kind of a train wreck, right? At some point, that humidity is going to get high enough that the moisture in the air is likely to start damaging other materials. And we have some general rules of thumb for that in our industry. Generally speaking, we say that anything that is greater than about 60% relative humidity is going to be problematic, right? Somewhere in that neighborhood. So we set that as a general rule of thumb, but it's a general rule of thumb. Depending on where you're at, 60% relative humidity may or may not cause damage in that particular structure. In some parts of the United States, at certain times of year, I would be concerned, quite frankly, even with 50% relative humidity, depending on where I'm at, right, and what that environment's normally exposed to. Now, if the humidity isn't increasing over time, then this is the part of the conversation that becomes uber critical. Impacting the amount of moisture inside of that space are two things. What is the flow rate into that environment versus what is the flow of humidity out of that environment? Right? In other words, what is my evaporation rate? What's adding moisture to the space? And is that evaporation rate greater than my humidity control rate? Right? If the water is evaporating at a rate that is greater than my dehumidification rate, then I'm going to see an increase in the amount of moisture over time. My humidity is going to be increasing in that environment, right? The flow rate in is greater than the flow rate out. Now, the reason I drive into this analogy is because when we see this as restorers, our knee-jerk reaction is always to look at dehumidification. If humidity is increasing over time, then we automatically assume that we need to add more dehumidifiers to that environment. That's the automatic assumption. But that may or may not be the right fix. In order to understand the right fix, I want you to start by looking here. Start looking at your evaporation in first. Why is evaporation greater than the amount of dehumidification you've installed? Why could that be true? Did you discover the full extent of water migration? Are you missing something? Now, if you missed an affected area or you missed some extraction, right, then adding a dehumidifier doesn't fix that. Right? There is wet area that you're not properly addressing, you're not properly monitoring, you're not going to verify hits its drying goals, right? So is there affected area that you're missing? Is there an additional source of moisture in that environment that you were unaware of, right? Are you in a commercial building that has a humidifier, right? Adding a dehumidifier is not the most effective way to fix that, right? Okay. Is there an infiltration of moisture that is coming in from outside? Take a look at your outdoor humidity. If the outdoor humidity is higher than your indoor humidity from a specific or humidity ratio or GPP standpoint, then that may be the reason why your humidity is increasing over time. Look at occupancy and see if doors and windows are getting left open on you. Are there building exhaust fans that are drawing that humidity in from outside? Again, adding a dehumidifier doesn't fix that. It's not the right fix for those problems, right? Addressing the source is the right fix. So by looking at the evaporation in and not automatically just putting a Band-Aid over the problem, you may be much more effective at resolving the issue. Now, if none of those are the issue, then take a look at all of the reasons why humidity out may be less than what you anticipated. You installed in a number of dehumidifiers because you performed a calculation. You made a reasonable, educated guess at how much dehumidification would be required. The amount you've installed is not effective. Why? Right? So ask the question, why is the amount of dehumidification not effective? Start with your hour meters on your dehumidifiers. Have they run for the amount of time that they should have since you plugged them in? Right? If they've been there for 24 hours, but your hour meters only show an increase of 2 hours, then the problem is that your occupants are turning off your equipment. Right? Adding another dehu doesn't fix that. All it does is give them one more power button to press when you leave, right? All right, and that's, again, by diving into the problem and asking the question why, we can be much more precise at identifying the actual root cause. Adding the dehumidifier wasn't the root cause. It's a solution to a symptom. Okay, it's a solution to a symptom. If you don't identify the actual root problem, then treating the symptom may just mask the problem. And that's kind of the lesson learned that we got out of that discussion. Now, again, as I've said a few times here today, if that conversation was a bit revolutionary for you, that's a taste of the lessons learned that we got out of the section on dehumidification and humidity control from the third quarter of this year. So go back a few episodes. You'll see it kind of late summer. We did an episode specifically on this, on dehumidification and humidity control, where we got much more in depth into this analysis and understanding its impact on decision making for humidity control. Now, I want to give this just one more flavor before we leave the topic of dehumidification and humidity control. You know, in a restoration project, typically what we see is we have a certain amount of humidity that is present in the structure, and that humidity changes over time, right? So humidity versus time. And generally, when we react to a water damage restoration project, we'll start with humidity somewhat elevated, right? So let's say that this green line that I'm going to add here, this green line is normal humidity, whatever normal is for your area. We're going to speak in relative terms here. When I inspect that project for the first time, generally the humidity that I'm going to see is elevated from normal, right? There's been a water damage, it's going to be elevated. Then I install my air movers and get my drying system running. And generally what we see is that initially that humidity is going to take a spike, right? It's going to increase initially. Now, when I'm on site that first day and I see that humidity spike, your first day visit is not complete, right? You should never leave a restoration project where the only data that you have shows humidity increasing, because you have no verification that you're in control of that environment. Control of the environment means that humidity is either flat or decreasing over time, not increasing. Because if I do nothing, there's a likelihood that this is what's going to happen over the next 24-hour period. Humidity is going to continue to increase, and we're going to end up well above the threshold for damages for that particular property, whatever that threshold is, whether you want to call that 60% relative humidity or whatever that kind of that rule of thumb threshold is for damage. So usually if you've extracted properly, first of all, you've installed your air movement properly, and you've installed an appropriate amount of dehumidification, that humidity spike is going to last minutes, potentially up to an hour. And then after that initial 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, what you should start to see is that humidity has begun to either level off or decrease. And you want to document that step or that change in humidity within the first monitoring visit. So this is a common problem that I see with a lot of restoration projects, is that one atmospheric reading or one psychrometric reading is taken. They take it upon arrival to the project. You capture what the job looked like before you do anything. And then we install all of our air movers and dehumidifiers and all the other work that we do, and then we leave. And we never pull out a hygrometer again. And to me, that's a massive missed opportunity, because the validation that you've installed the right drying system is control over that environment. And if you don't document that validation, then all you've done is you've walked away from a project with a massive amount of excess moisture, not knowing if you're in control. You don't know if you're mitigating, right? You don't know that you are preventing further damages from occurring in that environment. You don't know that until you know that you're in control of that environment. Okay. So again, just another really important and critical learning objective that came out of that episode earlier this year. Know that you're in control of humidity. It's called humidity control for a reason, right? Know that you're in control of that humidity. Pull out a hygrometer more than once, especially on that initial visit, because that's when it's most critical, right? If a job's going to go sideways and cause a lot of damage, it's going to do it when there's the most moisture present. And that's going to happen within that first several hours of the project. So be in control. Okay, be in control. That's kind of the lesson learned there. All right. And then kind of to round things out for our lessons learned in 2024, the other conversation that we had in depth this year was a discussion around air filtration devices. I'm noticing my screen didn't refresh there. There we go. Air filtration devices. So with air filtration devices, the most important conversation that we had was, first of all, just understanding what they are, right? An air filtration device it's a motorized air moving device that it contains a filter, and the air that is moving through that device, all or virtually all of that air being moved gets moved across some sort of a filter media. Sometimes they're HEPA filter media, sometimes they're not, depends on what the device is being used for. Sometimes they have activated carbon filters for odor, sometimes they don't, but they're there and intended to remove particulate or some other contaminant from the air. The S500 discusses their use, and the discussion is in a couple of different sections. One section is specific to when we are drying interstitial cavities. When you are moving air or forcing air to move through a space that you cannot see, where we cannot quantify contamination, you need to consider whether or not filtration is necessary as that air is removed from that space. Either that or just dumping the air outside, right? So if I've got an inter-air drying system that's drying air out of a set of wall cavities that are behind a bunch of cabinets where there's existing plumbing, and there may or may not be some previous water damage back in that area, and I just don't know. If I want to be as safe as possible, as I draw the air out of those cavities, I can have to run that air through a filter, or I can exhaust the air from that machine out a window, right? And dump that air outdoors. Just don't dump it right onto a sidewalk with a bunch of people traffic walking right through the exhaust stream. Because if you're concerned about contaminants, that's not where I want to dump it, right? So that's one discussion. That's in section 12.3.2. All right. The second discussion is in 12.4.5. And this is a discussion that talks about category 1 water damage. I want to stress that. Category 1 water damage. And on a category 1 water damage, where cleaning cannot effectively remove soils and particulates or other just normal contaminants that may be present in the environment, or there are high risk occupants, all right, in the space, then the S500 recommends that you use an air filtration device during the drying process in that environment. Do you need to use an AFD or an air filtration device on every water damage? No. But if you walk into an environment that's arguably category 1, but it's got a whole lot of visible dust and debris, and cleaning cannot effectively remove it, especially if there are high risk occupants that are present, there's a recommendation that you do, right? And it's a recommendation. It's not a should. It's not a requirement. And basically, as a recommendation, the way that you would treat a recommendation in the S500 is that a recommendation is a group of individuals that formed a consensus body, typically between 12 and 14 industry experts, that discussed the process, and what they determined is it's not necessarily done by all restorers that are reasonably prudent in the trade. However, it is a recommendation that would be made on a vast majority of those restorers in certain circumstances, and therefore should be considered by those that are doing this work. Consider it as a recommendation, right? So you're not required to do it, but it is recommended in those specific circumstances. All right. So that was the discussion on air filtration devices. We did a pretty deep dive into air filtration devices earlier this year, by the way. And in that dive in air filtration devices, we also discussed the installation of those air filtration devices. How would you install an air filtration device on a project to get the best use of that air filtration device? And there are a couple of lessons that we learned in that discussion. One of those lessons was that the air filtration device does not necessarily need to go in the middle of a room, right? When you're moving air in a circular fashion, in particular around the perimeter of a room, generally the particulate tends to move out towards that perimeter. So generally the best location for an air filtration device is going to be along that perimeter of a room, because that's usually where the dust is going to move to. Dust has mass. It has more mass than the gases that are in the air. So as you move that air around the perimeter of the room, that dust tends to migrate out towards the edges. The other conversation that we had is that if you have an air filtration device and you want to ensure that you're getting good circulation of air throughout the space, it may be beneficial to have the intake of the air filtration device in one location and the exhaust for the air filtration device in a separate location. So especially in an environment where you're not necessarily running air movers and the air movers aren't creating the circulation for you, let's say the air filtration device is there during demolition, the air filtration device is there during cleaning, or for some other purpose to control a known particulate that you're trying to remove when there isn't really good circulation, then drawing the intake in one location and exhausting to another location helps force the circulation through that environment. Kind of the way a forced air system would work with its supplies and returns. All right, so two things that we learned in our lessons learned on placement of air filtration devices. All right, so that's my reminder to go ahead and get queued up on your Q&A to make sure you've got the questions that you'd like addressed dropped into the chat. I'm going to touch on those here in just a moment. Before we get there, though, let me talk about a few things coming up in 2025. First of all, the very first episode that we're going to do in January of 25 is going to be on emergent technology. I'm super excited about this one. We're going to talk about some of the things that were brand new in 2024, some of the things we see coming out in 2025, and the use of that technology in the water damage mitigation space. We'll talk about where we see some practical applications, where we may see some challenges in those applications. So if you want kind of a synopsis of at least what I see on the radar of 2025 and into 2026 even, and how that may fit best with your business, this will be a great episode for you. So join us for Emergent Technology in 25 for our first episode next year. Also on the docket for next year, I've been kind of putting this one out there even this year, but I'm waiting patiently for publication. Our fire standards for my ICRC are getting super, super close to publication. My forecast is that we're going to see fire standards for the first time in January of 25. And the moment those hit the streets and they become published, I'm going to bring you content on those standards. So I've been waiting because I don't want to talk about those standards until they are published. But I think we're finally going to be at a place of publication in January. That's as the IICRC standards chairman, that's my role that I play for IICRC. That's my prediction. Don't take me to the bank because some things can slip to the right sometimes, but that's where I see it. So as soon as those publish, you'll start to see some content on the calendar for Technically Speaking related to it. Still haven't had an opportunity to get the S590 HVAC standards scheduled as a topic, but we're going to work on that for next year. And of course, because it's my area of expertise, we'll be talking a lot about water damage coming into next year. I've gotten a few emails from folks that gave me some great ideas for content, by the way. If you have not done that yet, please do. I've got a great suggestion on some deeper dives into hardwood flooring and interstitial spaces, for example. So please shoot me an email at brburton@corelogic.com if you've got some specific thoughts on what you'd like to see covered. And then finally, my last announcement, if you have not done so yet, make sure you check out Interconnect. If you haven't signed up for Interconnect, it's in January. It's going to be in California. Make sure you join us there. If you want the actual event dates, it's going to be January 13th through the 15th at the JW Marriott, Los Angeles. There is some room left, but I'll be super honest with you. Right now, it is forecast to sell out. I know you always hear that about events. Everybody tells you they're going to sell out, so sign up now. Well, I'm honestly telling you, there are not a lot of seats left, and it's going to sell out. So if you want to join us at Interconnect, make sure you get signed up soon so that we can reserve you a spot there. There is no guarantee that if you show up on site to register, that there'll be any room left to register. And the reason for that is because the venue that we pick has a limited number of seats, right? We can only have a certain level of occupancy. So unfortunately, I think this year we're going to be turning some people away. So make sure you get signed up. Thank you so much for your participation in season 3. And those of you that I've seen also in season 2 and season 1 of Technically Speaking, I'm excited to bring season 4 to you, kicking off with a look at the new technologies that we see coming to our industry. We'll kick that off with you in January 2025. And with that, I will say, I hope you very, very Merry holidays, a Happy New Year, and we will see you in season 4. Thank you for joining us today.